Hey there everyone, and this video here is going to kickstart our period 3 lecture video series here. And for this series, this is actually one of our first large scale units. The first two are pretty short compared to this one. We're covering everything from the years 1754 to 1800, and that may not seem like a lot as far as years go, but I promise you we are jam-packed full of good stuff here. We're going to start out here with the 7 Years' War. In this unit and then go all the way through to the presidencies of George Washington and John Adams. So there is a whole bunch of stuff in there in between as well. With this video, this first installment, we are actually going to bypass the 7 Years' War. We're going to do that a little bit differently in class together. We are going to start on the road to the American Revolution. So we are actually picking up after the French Indian War, and we're going to see kind of this big theme of taxation without representation and how this is going to lead to the colonists deciding that they can no longer take the tyranny of King George III and must fight to break away and create the United States. So if we take a quick look at a timeline here where we are, this road to revolution, that we're on this 13-year period following the end of the French and Indian War, we can see that it starts right away in 1763 here with the proclamation of 1763, and that is going to be a line of settlement that the British Parliament marks for the colonists. And we're going to see that when we cover the French and Indian War that the colonists or the British are going to earn a whole bunch of land. They're going to kick the French out of North America. So all that land that we saw before in period 2 that was New France is now controlled by England, and they control all that territory all the way out to the Mississippi River. Well, if you're a British colonist, you want to be able to move out that way. However, with the Proclamation of 1763, that is going to kind of stall them and say that you cannot go past the Appalachian Mountains. And this is really kind of the beginning of a series of rules and laws and taxes that are going to kind of make the colonists not so happy with their parents, the British Crown and the British Parliament. We then get into some acts. We'll talk about these as well. We'll do some in-class activities with this, kind of go over some of them. We don't need to memorize all of them, but know how some of them are important, like the Stamp Act, like the Townshend Act, the Intolerable Acts, and so forth. And then that will finally pave the way for, in 1776, the Declaration of Independence. So the first here of the acts or taxes that we're going to take a look at is the Stamp Act. And essentially what this does, and remember the reason for these taxes is that the British feel that they need to have the colonists pay their fair share of the revenue as a result of the debt from the French and Indian War. England is in far debt after this war, and they believe that because they use this war to protect the colonists should pay what they consider their fair share. The colonists don't see it this way. The colonists see it as a direct line of tyranny where the taxation without representation, without the consent of the governed, is a direct violation of their human rights. Now, just to put it in perspective, the amount of taxes these colonists are paying is equal to about 2 weeks worth of pay. Put that into a relationship to today. The average American pays probably about 25% of their 25% of their revenue in taxes. So obviously they're complaining. They would be completely upset with the way taxes are today. So just to put that in relationship, but they are upset about the fact that they are being taxed without having a say in government, in Parliament. And here you can see just a kind of a cartoon drawing showing what the Stamp Act does. Again, it's everything paper products, anything that would have to be made out of paper would have to have a special stamp on it, and that stamp would cost you money. Now, the colonists are not going to like this very much, and that even leads to mob rule. In many cases, especially in New England, where you have a lot more patriot sentiment, these boycotters are going to be protesting, and sometimes they're not going to be peaceful protesters, as we can see here in the painting here of the governor's house being attacked in New England. You also have examples of people being tarred and feathered who were tax collectors by the patriots. These men are harassing British loyalists who are trying to collect and trying to do what Parliament has ordered them to do. And the different groups that come out of this are going to be known as the Sons of Liberty and the Daughters of Liberty. And the Sons of Liberty is going to be the group that really kind of heads the different protests. We kind of think of them mostly with the Boston Tea Party, headed by men like Samuel Adams, and these British protesters are kind of leading the colonial resistance. Now, the Daughters of Liberty are also doing things to help out as well, and as you can imagine, this is more of a female organization that is doing things to try and help with the boycotts, like produce things at home. You start to see cottage industries come up where women are trying to make clothing, trying to make anything they can so they don't have to buy things from the British. Now, throughout the series here, I want you guys to think about the relationship between the colonists and the British. Think of it like a parent-child relationship. The parent is England. They have set certain rules and boundaries, the child of that being the colonists. And one of the rules they're setting are these taxes. Well, just like in real life, if you're a parent or if you've ever been a babysitter, if you've ever been in control of children, you know that when you lay down the law, you cannot backtrack, because what will happen if you do? They, of course, will want to keep annoying until they get their way. And this is going to kind of be a victory for the colonists and a failure for the British, because the very first act that is pushed forward, of the very first tax, the Stamp Act, is eventually going to be repealed because it was seen as ineffective. The boycotts worked. Okay, so the colonists feel like they can now pressure the British into doing what they want. The next set here being the Townshend Acts. Essentially what this was, the British were saying that the colonists had to pay certain taxes on things like lead, glass, paper, tea. And what this did was, again, they're protesting on the basis of taxation without representation. The Sons of Liberty are organizing new boycotts of these imported goods and trying to hurt the British economically. And with the boycotts comes more violence, and this is probably the most famous or infamous painting that is done from this time period, called The Bostonians Paying the Exciseman. And this is a painting that is showing the victim John Malcolm, who was a tax collector for the British, being basically tarred and feathered, being persecuted, being harassed, by the Sons of Liberty, because they don't want to have to pay the taxes that he's trying to collect. And the colonists will then go on to create these groupings called the Committees of Correspondence, and one of the more famous ones is going to be created by Sam Adams in Boston. And what these are is a way to try to have groups that come together. Think of it kind of like a club of patriots who are trying to communicate different boycotts and different efforts with the likes of other cities. So Boston would then communicate with Hertford or Rhode Island, New Haven, different places that might also have the sentiment that they do, is try to keep up with the different boycotts. And this is happening all at the same time that you have other acts that are being passed, like the Sugar Act, like the Tea Act and so forth, like the Townshend Acts, the Quartering Act and so forth. So these are all happening, and they're kind of all happening congruently together. We then in 1770 have the Boston Massacre, and we probably have all heard of this before. This is where you have the British troops who are stationed and they're taunted by an angry mob. They're harassed by this mob, having things thrown at them. Eventually, a troop fires upon the crowd, and 5 colonists are killed. And Crispus Attucks is officially the first one killed in the incident. And what this does, it really kind of pushes the conflict even farther, and it leads to the 5 men being tried for murder. And it is actually, ironically, John Adams who becomes their lawyer and actually is able to have them acquitted of the charges and serve mild punishments. But this is really kind of pushing the sentiments, and we can see here that Paul Revere's etching here, we've kind of seen this all before, shows the Boston Massacre, and it definitely shows it from a patriot perspective, because it makes it look like the British are the aggressors, and it makes them look like they are basically just killing innocents in the streets. We then have a Tea Act in 1773, and what this does, it essentially creates a monopoly where they are forced to trade with the British's East India Tea Company, and the merchants don't like this. They want to have the freedom to be able to trade tea with whoever they want, and the response to this is going to be the Boston Tea Party that we think of, with the dumping of £18,000 worth of tea into the Boston Harbor. So you can imagine that if you were the British and the colonists have just cost you millions and millions of dollars worth of tea, you're going to want to respond. Again, remember that this is a parent and child relationship. Britain is the mother country. They have to scold the child colonists just like you would if your child broke something in your home. You want to scold them so they don't do it again. And the British come up with what's known as the Intolerable Acts. And essentially, what this does, it creates a closing off or a quarantine of Massachusetts. It closes off their harbors in Boston. It forces them to quarter troops, and it really is it militarizes the likes of Boston as a city and takes away really any kind of freedom or any sort of economic revenues for the people of Boston to make money. And this is the effect of this is going to kind of be one of the last straws of the colonists, and they are going to form the first Continental Congress to draw up a Declaration of Rights that they believe they deserve and that the King George has kind of stomped on, and eventually this will lead to the Declaration of Independence. And with this Continental Congress, you start to have a beginning of the colonies finally coming together. That plan that Benjamin Franklin originally had with the Albany Plan, the join or die flag, is really kind of starting to come to fruition, where you have delegates from every colony coming together in this kind of cry that we must help Boston, and they will meet in Philadelphia. We then, in 1775, we have the first kind of likes of conflict between the British and the colonists in what we know as Lexington and Concord, the first shots heard around the world, where we essentially have the British who are trying to they're marching towards Concord to take a set of colonial weapons, a armory that they have found, and they want to disarm the militia and the different colonists in Concord and Lexington. And on their way, the Minutemen are going to intercept this, and they're going to face them at Lexington and then at Concord. And this is really kind of the start of the battling or conflict, I should say, for the British and the colonists, kind of the beginning of the Revolutionary War itself. So the next thing here, the last thing here we really want to take a look at in this video is going to be kind of where these ideas come from. And if you remember from world history, the Enlightenment, that's really where we are. And you should remember this from your 9th grade studies. These different philosophers from the Enlightenment period in the 1600s really kind of give the ideas that the colonists will then use to want to declare their independence from England. If we look at this chart, I like how this does a really, really good job of kind of showing how the Enlightenment directly leads to the American Revolution. And some of the philosophers that we talk about, as far as John Locke, Montesquieu, Hobbes, Rousseau, a lot of these men are kind of exploring the ideas of how to look at society scientifically. And that we're not just going to go along with divine right, that we're going to use reason and advocate for these truths to kind of come through and show what the purpose of government is. And from this, a lot of the ideas that the colonists come from, like that of John Locke in particular, he's really the one who leads the Enlightenment for the American Revolution more than anybody else, is that the purpose of the government is to protect your natural rights of life, liberty, and property. And if the government does not protect those rights, then you need to get rid of that government and create a new one, that social contract. And that's really kind of where we're coming from, where these ideas are influencing a lot of these founding fathers like Madison, like Jefferson, like Adams. They were staunch historians. They were staunch readers of the philosophers like John Locke, and they believed that his ideas were true, that these were truths that needed to be held, and that their natural rights were violated by King George III. So we'll then see, once they kind of declare that their life, liberty, and property have been abused and the social contract has been broken, that when we get to later parts in our unit with the Constitution, with Montesquieu, that you're going to see the likes of separation of powers and checks and balances. And a lot of these Enlightenment philosophers like Locke and Montesquieu are going to lead to these more, for their times, modern day philosophers like Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson to write the likes of Common Sense and the Declaration, kind of showing these Enlightenment ideas in full form in practice. So guys, I hope this was an easy way to kind of go through and see how do we get from the French and Indian War all the way to the actual revolution itself. We will continue to kind of dive into the Revolutionary War and what's taking place during that time period. Please again come in with any questions you might have, and I will see you in class.